lineups. And what else would you find? The wonderful, the amazing Mr. Voice himself, Mr. Derek Shelmerdine, the musical historian. Evening, Derek.
Hi, it's great to be back, mate. What a great introduction.
Of course, you're not...
I'll come again. Again.
As you might tell, dear listener, we do get on very well. He's a great guy, Derek. And what he doesn't know about music, you could probably write on the back of a postage stamp. Is that right?
Well, I mean, it could be a fairly big postage stamp, but yeah, I try and keep up with it all. Yeah. It's good fun. I love it. I've always loved it.
And of course, we're trying something new out tonight. You're going to be on twice tonight.
That's right.
You're doing your regular little 30 minutes or so.
That's right.
In the first hour. Then you're going to go off and have a quick whatever, probably a couple of pints of beer to get you through or half a gallon of coffee to keep you awake. And then you're coming back at 10 o'clock. And we're going to do an On This Day, September the 15th. Before we actually go into the first bit, Derek, can you just give us a little flavour of what's coming up in the last hour?
Absolutely. Well, what it is, it's very much Rock'n'Roll Unravelled. And each month, it looks at the particular month. So we'll look at what happened specifically this day, but we'll stretch it across, actually, what happened in the world of rock and roll from its roots through the mid-70s punk. Across the years for September, so there's a lot of good stuff there. I mean, it picks up from here as well because the Beatles Love Me Do sessions, were in September. There'll be some Frank Zappa, Roger Waters. I mean, it's John Lee Hooker. It's quite a wide range.
You can obviously tell by the kind of things that Derek's mentioned there that when it's called Rock'n'Roll Unravelled, it's not literally rock and roll. It's the whole musical field, isn't it?
It's the whole genre, basically.
It could be anything. It could be pop music. It could be rock and roll. It could be rock. It could be soul and funk. It could be Marvin Gaye. It could be anything that happened on this day over the past 60 years, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Back into the 20s, really. Because the recordings, as we know them now, 78 really started to appear in the 20s. So even though the music goes back way beyond that, I mean, if you think of folk music, I mean, that goes back centuries.
Yeah.
Blues goes back well into the last century.
Yeah.
Well, century before that.
Yeah, that's true. So anyway, we're going to do our normal little 30-minute slot now, and tonight you've chosen, I should say, three of probably the most outstanding producers, that we think of. You think of a producer, your mind automatically clicks to at least one of these three. Who are we doing then tonight, Derek?
Well, I thought we'd look at three producers who've really left a large footprint across the rock and roll world, starting with Sam Phillips, then Phil Spector, and the third one I thought was George Martin. Between the three of them, I mean, they have left one heck of a legacy in rock and roll. And if you look at Sam Phillips, he was born January the 5th, 1923, in Florence, Alabama. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986. That was the inaugural year. So, you can see the kind of pedigree he's got. And he actually did own three record labels. He's well known, obviously, as the guy who founded the Sun record label. But he started off with a label called It's the Phillips, which he owned jointly with a DJ called Dewey Daddy-O Phillips, no relation. And they only released one particular song, a one-man band called Joe Louis. But one of the first real landmarks in Phillips's career was that he was responsible for recording Rocket 88 with Jackie Brenston, released as Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats. I mean, we've talked about this previously, so I won't go into a lot of detail.
You've always considered that to be the first record?
It's generally considered to be the first rock and roll record. He didn't actually release it on Sun because at that time he was actually looking to people like Chess, and this was released on Chess, to get a bigger exposure. And his first release on Sun came actually after that, in 1952, March 1st, a guy called Johnny London, with a track called Driving Slow, which is pretty collectible nowadays. But Philip's story really starts with Elvis Presley, who came in to make a private recording, a couple of private recordings in 1953 and 1954. And when he came in the second time, he was famously asked by Marian Kaiska, "Who do you sound like?" And Elvis said, "I don't sound like nobody." That might not sound like Elvis, but that's the sort of voice Elvis would have had if he'd been born near Liverpool.
It was good enough for me. It was good enough for me.
Yeah, and what happened was that Sam Phillips liked his voice, but couldn't find the right song, and Elvis came in to try something out that Sam Phillips had found, and it wasn't really working, but he said, have a look at this, and it was a track called That's All Right, that would originally been released by Arthur Crudup back in 1946. And this proved to be an absolute sensation. The same Daddy-O Phillips, mentioned earlier as co-owner of It's the Phillips record label, he actually played this. Sam Phillips rushed it over to Daddy-O Phillips' radio show, the Red Hot and Blue show, and Daddy-O Phillips played the song almost non-stop that whole evening. Absolutely incredible. Wasn't he
inundated with phone calls as well? Because they just said, we've got to keep hearing this.
Yeah. It's a heck of a story, that. And this is back in 1954, middle of 1954. Elvis recorded a couple of more singles with Sun, Good Rockin' Tonight, Milk Cow Blues Boogie, and Carl Perkins is another big player of this. He came along with his first single in 1955, and that was released on the Flip label, which was the third of Phillips's labels. Phillips actually abandoned the Flip label when a guy from LA rang him up and said, I understand you're using the word flip for a record label. Well, I've been running a record label called Flip in LA for some little while now. And rather than get himself into legal action, he decided that his future releases would all be on Sun. And that was Movie Mag that Carl Perkins released as his first single with Sam Phillips. Then Elvis released a couple more, because he'd released 5 altogether with Sam, Babyliss Playhouse, and his final single, Mystery Train. And what's interesting is, big day for the diary, 1955, August the 1st. It was the last, the release date of Elvis's last Sun single, Mystery Train, and the release date of Carl Perkins' first single on Sun, Let the Jukebox Keep on Playing. Elvis is starting to move on now. But just before Elvis moved on at the end of 1955, Sam Phillips opened up the all-female radio station with the slogan 1,000 beautiful watts, which I thought was really rather nice. But Carl Perkins was very much coming into the frame now. Beginning of 1956, he released Blue Suede Shoes. And he had a bad car crash around that time. And he often blames the fact that Elvis's cover of Blue Suede Shoes sort of overtook his and became the definitive version almost. But despite that, Perkins still managed to get Sun's first million seller with Blue Suede Shoes. And of course, around this time, middle of 56, Roy Orbison and the Teen Kings re-recorded a track they'd already recorded elsewhere called Ooby Dooby. And like other record owning, producing gentlemen, Sam Phillips didn't always get it right. A guy called Harold Jenkins came knocking on the door of Sam's studio one of the days, auditioned, failed abysmally. Later, well, not much later, changed his name to Conway Twitty and became one of the biggest all-time ever sellers of country music on singles and albums. I haven't got the number with me, but I think it was something like sort of 80 or 90 singles and about the same number of albums. He was phenomenally large.
But it's funny, I wouldn't know a Conway Twitty track if it fell on me. I really wouldn't.
Right.
I just...
It's only make-believe would be a good one.
Got it. Okay, yeah, okay, fair enough. No, you just reminded me, yeah.
But he is, I mean, he's not he's not the kind of guy that springs to mind. You know, Willie Nelson.
Absolutely not. No.
Johnny Cash and the like. But he is one of the biggest selling country stars of all time. And sadly, Sam Phillips turned him down. But then, really, I think, one of the guys you could also think of as a king of rock and roll, Jerry Lee Lewis, came on the scene. And shortly after joining, he was in the studio with Carl Perkins recording Matchbox. He was playing piano on Carl Perkins' Matchbox single. And Elvis dropped by, because he'd left by then. And also Johnny Cash dropped by. And on the 4th of December 1956, they recorded... Well, they had a jam session, basically. They were just messing around. And there's a very, very famous picture of the four of them standing by with I think Elvis sitting at the piano and the other three standing around of that session. It's debated whether Cash was actually on the recordings, because he came and went. He was with his lady, I think, at the time, and they went off shopping. And some pundits believe that Johnny Cash actually left before they recorded a lot of the tapes. I mean, they were eventually released as an album called the $1 Million Quartet, but I mean, that would have been some session to have sat in on. Because what Sam Phillips did, he just let the tape roll, so there's hours and hours of stuff. And really then, I mean, Jerry Lee Lewis really took the world by storm. A whole lot of shaking going on, Great Balls of Fire. Released High School Confidential, but then came to the UK for his first British tour. Transpired that the lady with him was his wife, who was the 13-year-old daughter of his bass-playing cousin. And when it was pointed out that the good folks of Britain take a dim view of people having 13-year-old wives, he pointed out that, well, in Louisiana, lots of people do this. Well, this ain't Louisiana, he was told. He did three. It was his headlining tour. He did three gigs, and he had to pull out of the tour. Went back to America. Very long story short, was his rock and roll career came down in flames. He released a single called "Return of Jerry Lee," an attempt at damage limitation. He even took a full-page ad in Billboard around that time, but still didn't placate his fans. The Americans left him in droves, and his rock and roll career was over. He did reinvent himself as a country star because he came from a country kind of background and religious background, but really quite sad. I think, of all of the heroes of rock and roll, Jerry Lee Lewis, I mean, he embodies the rock and roll spirit. Just
because he said, "I do."
Absolutely. He did marry her again later. Sadly, they divorced about 10 years later. I mean, he stayed with... he stayed. He'd recorded quite a lot of stuff. He stayed with them until the early 60s. The last of his singles was released in 65. And pretty much now we're into the latter days of Sun.
Does because obviously the Sun track sold so well.
Yep.
Are they considered to be rarities now? I mean, if you get an Elvis on the Sun label, is it considered to be a rarity, even though it would have sold in its millions?
They're very well. They didn't sell in that large numbers. Elvis's certainly didn't. And it's an American label, remember? So not an awful lot of Sun records would have found their way into the UK, because they were all covered over here on RCA, London American, and other labels. So I think if you've got any Sun records in halfway decent mint-type condition, they will be the sort of thing that would give you a very nice pension. Because in record collecting, I think there are fads and phases and things ebb and flow. But I think something as classic as the Sun singles would always be a good investment. They're unlikely to... They might level out, as like doo-wop's leveled out a bit, prog I think's leveled out a bit. Beatles continues to climb ever onward. But it was really pretty much... He carried on producing. He produced the Yardbirds, recorded The Train Kept Rolling while they were on tour in America at Sun Studios. But despite people like Johnny Cash and Roy Orbison, who did very little with Sun, they recorded quite a few singles, but no real success until they changed labels. And the last Sun single released was January 1968, and it was by a band called, believe it or not, Load of Mischief. And it was a track called, a single, Back in My Arms Again and I'm a Loser. And that was the last one, January 68. And on the 1st of July 1969, Sam Phillips sold Sun Records to Shelby Singleton, the back records at the Mercury, I think he was an executive of. And that was pretty much it. Interestingly enough, he made a lot of money, but he made a lot of money out of a very early investment, shrewd investment in Holiday Inn hotels. And I'm pretty sure that when the radio station with the ladies, I think that was actually, the studio itself was in a Holiday Inn hotel. Not 100% sure on that, but I'm pretty sure.
So had he have been somebody who just relied purely on his investment in Sun Studios, he probably wouldn't have made
an awful lot of money.
He'd have made a living, but he'd have got by.
Yeah, he'd be in the record books, the history books, because of Elvis.
You get that quite a lot, don't you, where at the time it just doesn't seem like much is happening. But with retrospective vision, we can look back at it and think, oh wow, if you could be transported back there, you'd be going in there and you'd be buying dozens of these singles and then selling them on 50 years later.
Oh, absolutely. To have a time machine, go back and buy a few singles, or even to get back the singles you bought, keep them in good condition. When you first bought them, wouldn't be
if only we'd realised when we were playing them on our Dan sets where you had 10 stacked up on one and they'd go to the other, and of course they'd start whirling around and spinning and and slipping and everything, and then of course the needle wouldn't quite lift up and it'd drag across the whole lot, and you think, if only I'd kept them in all the original covers. Of course some people do, and some people did,
that's right,
and they've still got them, and good luck to them.
Absolutely.
But I'm afraid people like me, I bought my records to listen to, and I never thought of them as being my pension.
Exactly.
They were just, let's put this on because it just sounds so good.
Yeah, I mean, you don't find, if you come across mint condition 50s and 60s singles, you're doing very well.
Yeah. You probably realise it's never been played.
Well, yeah. I mean, occasionally
you
find the market gets a few hundred or few thousand singles that have been found in an attic of an old record shop that went out of business years ago. There was an auction in America a few months ago, I was reading in Goldmine, I think. And somebody came across several thousand singles from the time, never been played, still factory wrapped, some of them. And they were going off for auction. Absolutely amazing.
I know somebody is supposed to. I mean, you might have to take these stories with a pinch of salt, but somebody is supposed to have found in a skip. I think it was, I don't know how many pressings of a single by a guy called Larry Lurex, who of course was Freddie Mercury. And of course, I mean, whether they took them home or not, I don't know. But how these things find their way into a skip, I'll never know.
Well, they just get thrown away. Record collectors, you find occasionally, you find record dealers every Sunday in car boot sales because people are clearing out stuff and they don't know what they've got. I mean,
well, I've told this story before, but a friend of mine in 1972, I think it was, he sold me Arnold Lane by Pink Floyd. Yeah. And it turned out not to be the normal Arnold Lane by Pink Floyd. It was a promo pressing, so it had the big A on one side and the big B on the other side. Yeah. And I can't remember how long ago it was. I thought, well, I never play it. What shall I do with it? I thought, I'll see what it goes. I'll put it up on eBay and see if I can get anything for it. So bear in mind, I paid 50 pence for it when I bought it from him. I sold it to a Pink Floyd museum in Mexico City for £264.99p.
Yeah.
And had it had its picture cover, it would have been £1,000. Yeah. But it was just in its normal Columbia paper sleeve. Yeah. There you go. Wow. So next time you're at a car boot sale, look out for things because you just don't know, do you?
Yeah, that's right.
You just don't know.
If you haven't heard of the record label, it means it's either worth nothing or it could be worth a few bob. Yeah. The sad thing is you have to know the kind of things you're looking for.
Yeah.
But having said that,
but you could
Bob Dylan's first album, well, not the first, Freewheeling, that was withdrawn immediately and changed 3 or 4 of the tracks. There are only about 3 or 4 pressings known to exist, copies known to, and one turned up apparently in a sort of house sale on a New York street, and somebody bought for $1. That's worth
a few bob.
Loads. Not very good condition apparently, but to have that in your collection, unreal.
I tell you what, about time we play some music. We're yakking away here, but we're enjoying it. And dear listener, I do hope you're enjoying it as well. If you've got any questions to ask Derek, studio@meridianfm.com is our email. We'd love to hear from you. What should we play? Let's play some music.
Well, I thought Sam Phillips, Elvis Presley, his first single, That's All Right, piece of rock and roll history.
Played it before, and let's play it again. How about that then? Like I say, I've played it, I don't know how many times before, but who cares? Because it's just so good, isn't it?
It's a piece of rock and roll history.
Absolutely wonderful. Mr. Elvis, of course, and that's all right.
With the next guy I'm going to look at, Phil Spector. Whereas you could very much say that Sam Phillips is a pioneer of rock and roll. I mean, there's an understatement. Phil Spector, one of his main legacies is he was the first, arguably, certainly one of the first producers who actually became a household name. I can remember, because I'm very much a product of this era, And I can remember that people would talk about, have you heard the latest Phil Spector single? They wouldn't talk about, have you heard the latest Ronette single? And Phil Spector, his artists were very, very interchangeable. There's a great example of that as we sort of get into the story. But, I mean, he was born in 1939, and when he was only about 10 years old, his father committed suicide. And his headstone is inscribed with, "To know him was to love him." And that became the title of Phil Spector's first song that he recorded, the first song he produced, first song he wrote, when it was a hit for the Teddy Bears, when they just changed the tense and said, "To know him is to love him." And from that, he joined Atlantic in 1961, and he was a co-producer of the original version of Twist and Shout by the Top Notes. That was actually a Burt Burns composition. Burt Burns was never very happy with Spector's Top Notes, Twist and Shout, so he took it to One for the Isley Brothers, decided to produce it himself, because as well as being a producer, writer, he was also a producer, and gave the Isley Brothers their first worldwide hit. But undeterred, Phil rolls on, and he formed, he actually joined a guy called Lester Sill and Lee Hazelwood, and they took him on as an apprentice producer. Lee, it's a long story, and the essence is that Lester Sill and Lee Hazelwood had a bit of a falling out, as people do in the music industry, and Lester Sill turned to Phil Spector and said, "Well, hey, let's form a label." So they formed Phillies, which is what most of the Wall of Sound, which is very much the sound that Phil Spector's associated with. And their first single was sort of late 61 now. First single was "There's No Other Like My Baby," the Crystals. But a really interesting saga from the Phil Spector catalogue is in mid-1962, when he was recording "He's a Rebel," actually written by Gene Pitney. And he wanted it as a Crystal single, but Crystals weren't actually available at the time, so he took Darlene Love, another one of his acts, a lady with a great voice, into the studio, and Darlene Love and her backing band, the Blossoms, actually recorded the song "He's a Rebel," that was then released by Phil Spector as the Crystals, as by the Crystals. So it was the Crystals single you think you're listening to. If you can find a recording that says this is the original recording, you'll actually be listening to Darlene Love on the lead vocals, and if you actually listen to it, she's got a much softer and a lot more powerful kind of voice. It's a very different kind of voice. But one of the reasons I think he had this dilemma was that he just released the Crystals' "He Hit Me," and it felt like a kiss, which apparently was the story written by Goffin and King, and apparently husband and wife team, their babysitter, little Eva, apparently once said that to them. She turned up with a black eye and the like. This is all reputedly, if there are any lawyers listening, well reported, but reputedly. And they asked her what happened, and she said, "Well, my boyfriend, he hit me, and it felt like a kiss." That was withdrawn actually very soon afterwards. It did get reviewed. It was actually released, and that would be an interesting track to have. But then 63, Spector's in his element, Do Ron Ron, Be My Baby, and the Christmas album, A Christmas Gift for You, which is often thought, I certainly love it, it's the ultimate Christmas album. He spread himself around as well. He was quite a face in the 60s, Phil Spector. And with the Rolling Stones, for instance, when they released Not Fade Away, in the UK, they coupled it with Little by Little, and the B-side was written by Spector and Felge being the name that the Rolling Stones tended to use when they all contributed to the writing. Taken after a flatmate that some of the Stones had at one time. I mean, that's got a Phelge. Now, that is a surname to go into the history books with. He played tuned-down guitar. Some people say it was bass guitar. On the Rolling Stones, Play With Fire. But then Phil Spector really hit the ascendancy with the Righteous Brothers, You've Lost That Loving Feeling. They'd previously been with Moonglow, moved to Phillies, and it was a massive hit for them. I think they were the first white vocal group that Spector actually took on board, and that's pretty much when the sort of blue-eyed soul moniker came into being. But as with Phil Spector, they fell out. Phillies moved on. The Righteous Brothers moved on and joined Ferv, and Spector sued them for a reputed $3 million. And the next part of the story really is Tina Turner, early '66, recorded River Deep, Mountain High, meant to be Phil Spector's next really big thing, but it bombed. In the UK, it did reasonably well. It got to number 3, but in America, it only got to number 88. And to all intents and purposes, that was the end of the Wall of Sound.
Strange, because I think it's an absolutely phenomenal single.
It was very successful in the UK.
Yeah.
Americans obviously hated it.
I wonder what their opinion of it is now.
It's probably got, because of Tina Turner.
Yeah.
Because, at the time, it was Ike and Tina Turner. But, Ike Turner was a major player in the R&B world. To all intents and purposes, he should have had that first rock and roll single, Rocket 88. It should have been by Ike Turner, the Kings of Rhythm. It was only the record. He released 2 of the tracks by him and 2 of the tracks by Jackie Brenston, simply because of the lead vocals. There's a twist of irony. There's a Pete Best situation you don't want to look back on, really. And then Spector, the Wall Sound's over. He was an easy rider. He appeared for 2 minutes. But he did a lot of work with the Beatles, firstly with Lennon, Instant Karma. And the Beatles had when they were falling apart, they were planning to put a whole big project called Get Back Together. Very long story short is that really didn't work out. And the Glyn Johns version of the album he produced, none of them really liked. So they brought Spector in because John Lennon had worked with him, really liked him. And over a period of about 3 weeks in the March of 1970, he turned Get Back tapes into the Let It Be album, and it became the Beatles' swan song, even though it was actually recorded before Abbey Road. It just went on and on and on. He had a big falling out with John Lennon, though, produced John Lennon's Rock'n'Roll album, and he decided, because he booked the studio time, that he owned the tape, so he took them home, wouldn't give them back to John Lennon, waved a gun around at John Lennon. Long story short is he eventually got some of the tracks back and released an album with some of the tracks on his Rock'n'Roll album are the Spector tracks. Spector also did some work with Leonard Cohen, surprisingly enough, Death of a Ladies' Man, where both of them co-wrote most of the songs. And the Ramones, End of the Century, is a Phil Spector production. But really it all came to crashing down on February the 3rd, 2003, when actress Lana Clarkson was found dead in Phil Spector's mansion. He had a couple of trials, because the first one, I think it was a hung jury. But he was eventually, after 2 trials, found guilty of murder, 19 years to life. So whether we ever see him again on the streets, there's another thought. He was born in 1939. But he's got, I think, one of the most interesting stories. The guy was apparently a nightmare. He was reported widely as waving guns around at people in the Ramones recording sessions. They said they were frightened to death half the time they went in. And interchangeable performers. Oh dear me, I need this Crystal single. They're not around to record it. Let's see what Darlene's doing.
Let's hear something that Phil Spector did, because whether he's waving guns around or whether he's languishing in prison, I don't know. But he was good at one thing, wasn't he?
Oh, he was brilliant.
Just magical stuff, absolutely magical stuff. And wow, for those days as well.
It really kept...
Not a computer inside.
Always bear in mind that Phil Spector used to walk around with a badge saying, long live mono. He did not like stereo. And he probably produced the most stereophonic potential singles of almost all time, certainly of the 60s. So the word irony was probably coined after somebody had a chat with Spector.
Now we're going to move on to the probably most famous one of the lot, I guess.
Yeah, George Martin, very much known for the Beatles. But there was George Martin before the Beatles, and there was certainly George Martin after the Beatles. He joined EMI as an assistant in 1950, and he was very much involved with jazz. Parlophone he was an assistant to Oscar Preuss, who was the head of Parlophone, and Parlophone was very much a minor label to EMI, jazz, comedy, novelties. Its first hit was Peter Ustinov's Mock Mozart. An interesting one, though, that's 52. An interesting one is in 1956, Bad Penny Blues, Humphrey Lyttelton. The engineer on that was Joe Meek. George Martin was actually the A&R. He didn't produce it. But if you ever listen to Lady Madonna and listen to Bad Penny Blues, you will hear the melody, Bad Penny Blues, Lady Madonna. The fact that it's George Martin, the fact that they both recorded on Parlophone is probably the only reason that there wasn't a Stairway to Heaven case some years later. And like all good producers, he turned somebody down, and that was Tommy Steele. He saw, in 56, he saw Tommy Steele at the Two Eyes Skiffle Bar, coffee bar in London, didn't like him. Tommy Steele went on to become Britain's first rock and roll hero, rock and roll star. So everybody gets it wrong somewhere down the line. He produced things like Flanders and Swan comedy, Beyond the Fringe, for any fans of Beyond the Fringe. He did start to get involved in pop before the Beatles. He produced a guy called Paul Raven and a track called Tower of Strength. Now, Paul Raven became Gary Glitter and a very successful career up until his private life caught up with him. But then we get to the Beatles, really, in 1962. The Beatles went into the recording session with him, Abbey Road, firstly in June. He took a distinct dislike to Pete Best. And by the time they came back in September, Ringo Starr was the drummer. But he didn't really like Ringo Starr either. And they recorded Love Me Do for a third time on the 11th of September. We'll look at this a bit later. And he had session drummer Andy White in there. But it was actually Ringo Starr's single version that was released as the single on the Red label. And Andy White's that was released on the Please Please Me as the album track. But he was unable... Martin was unable to convince Capitol in the US to pick the Beatles up, so VJ took them on. Actually, on the back of Frank Ifield, they'd signed Frank Ifield up, and they took the Beatles on the back of that. George Martin left EMI in '65 and set up his own independent recording organisation called Associated Independent Recording, AIR. But if you look at the Beatles, I mean, some of the innovations there, I Feel Fine, the opening feedback, Rain, backward vocals, Tomorrow Never Knows off Revolver album. John Lennon's been heard to suggest that was their first psychedelic record. Strawberry Fields Forever had different takes, different speeds, and they were all spliced together. And when you think that this is, well, Sgt. Pepper, obviously that's about the same time as Sgt. Pepper, because Strawberry Fields was originally intended to be on the Pepper album. And Pepper was recorded on 2 4-track machines. And they were experimenting by splicing different takes at different speeds to get different pitches. Absolutely unbelievable. But after Pepper, really, it was the Beatles went downhill over a 2 or 3 period. And by the time of the release of their movie on the 20th of May 1970, none of the Beatles attended. After the Beatles, George produced people like Mahavishnu Orchestra, Jeff Beck, Cheap Trick. Well, that wasn't well received. All music calls it a complete botch. So not everything George Martin did turned to gold. He produced the first post-Michael Schenker album for UFO, 1980. Ultravox's quartet album, their 6th. And he opened Montserrat, at his Air Studios in Montserrat, but that was destroyed by a hurricane, Hurricane Hugo, in fact, in 1989. And that's really it for this whistle-stop look at George Martin. He died recently, 2016. I mean, the guy was 90 years old. He did all the reworking of the Beatles stuff. Absolutely phenomenal career. I mean, if the Beatles hadn't been produced by George Martin, it's very difficult to know if they'd be anything like the Beatles that we have as a legacy today. I think he was so instrumental. The guy came from classical music background, and he just had such a massive influence on what they were doing. I mean, he sacked their first drummer at their first meeting. What was interesting, though, is the Beatles stood by their grounds, and they didn't record a cover that he wanted them to record.
That's amazing, isn't it? It's absolutely incredible.
I mean, all 3 of them, I think.
Well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We're zipping up now very closely to the 9 o'clock news. We'll play a little bit of the Beatles on the other side of the news. This is me, Dave Roberts, on Meridian 107 FM. And now the news at 9 o'clock.